This is section 2.2, Introduction, part 2, okay, where we talked about conditional statements, we talked about the hypothesis and the conclusion. Now we're going to talk about the negation, and negation means we're going to talk about the negative form of these statements. So the negation of a statement, P, is the opposite of the statement, okay? This symbol right here, you're going to see this quite a bit, that means not P, okay? The negation of a statement is the sky is blue, the sky is not blue is the negation of it. Okay, essentially you're adding the word not in here. You can use negations to write statements related to conditional. Okay, every conditional has 3 related conditional statements. Okay, so we've talked about conditionals. Use the given hypothesis and conclusion. Here's an example. If the measure of angle A is equal to 15, then the angle A is acute. That'd be the conditional. Hypothesis is angle A is 15. Conclusion is angle A is acute. If P, then Q, that's what that means. Okay, that's how to read that. Okay, now, the converse. The converse, what I'm going to do with the converse is I'm going to take and flip the hypothesis and the conclusion. So the converse says exchange the hypothesis and the conclusion. So now it's going to read if angle A is acute, then the measure of angle A is 15. And here it's if Q, then P. Okay, so essentially the converse, I'm just taking the conditional and flipping them. All right, the inverse. This is where we start to talk about negations. These guys right here are negative. They should have the word not in them. Okay, so the inverse. The inverse, it's going to negate both the hypothesis and the conclusion of the conditional. So I'm going to take the conditional statement right here, and I'm going to make it negated. I'm going to put not in there. So if the measure of angle A does not equal 15, that does not equal that symbol right there, then angle A is not acute. And it says, if not P, then not Q. Okay? And then finally the contrapositive. The contrapositive is going to negate both the hypothesis and the conclusion of the converse. So as you look at these two right here are related. Okay? Along with these two right here being related. They're the exact same thing except for one is the negation of the other. Okay? So in the contrapositive, it's going to say if angle A is not acute, similar to this up here, if angle A is not acute, then the measure of angle A is not 15 degrees. Okay? If not P, then not Q. Okay, so below are the truth values from the related statements above. Equivalent statements have the same truth value. Okay? So in this case, if the measure of angle A is 15, then A is acute. If A is a 15-degree angle, it's going to be acute. That's true. It's less than 90 degrees. Converse says, if angle A is acute, then angle A is 15. Well, if angle A is acute, that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be 15 degrees. It could be 25. Okay? So in this case is false. It's not always, they're not always going to match up this way. So the converse is not always false. The inverse is not always false. That's not the way it works. It depends on what the statement reads. The inverse says if the measure of angle A is not 15, then the angle A is not acute. Okay? If it's not 15 degrees, it's not acute. That's false as well because it could be 25. Is that acute? Yes, it is. Okay? So all I'm doing right now is I'm showing you counterexamples. Contrapositive. If angle A is not acute, then the measure of angle A is not 15 degrees. If it's not acute, then it's got to be obtuse, which means, or right, which means it's 90 or above. It's not going to be 15 degrees. That's true. Okay, so now as we look here at this, and we look at these, okay, they're going to ask you to write the converse, inverse, and contrapositive of the following. What are the truth values of each? And if a statement is false, give a counterexample. So, here is the conditional. This guy right here, if the figure is a square, then the figure is a quadrilateral. That's the conditional statement. Okay? So I need to write a converse. Remember, the converse, I take the hypothesis and the conclusion. Okay, I'll mark this on here. This guy right here is the hypothesis. This guy right here is the conclusion. Okay? So on the converse, I'm just going to take the hypothesis and the conclusion and we're going to flip spots. So for the converse, it says if the figure is a quadrilateral, then the figure is a square. Okay. Now, what we have to do is we got to figure out if this is true or false. If it's a quadrilateral is a four-sided figure, then it is a square. Is that true or false? Well, this is false. And the reason that it's false, give me another four-sided figure that's not a square, that's a rectangle. That's a counterexample. Okay? The next one, the inverse. Okay? So now the inverse, I take the conditional, and I'm going to negate it. So in other words, I'm going to put not in there. So if the figure is not a square, it's not a square, then it's not a quadrilateral. Okay? If it's not a square, then it's not a quadrilateral. This, true statement-wise, is also false, because if it's not a square, it could be a rectangle. And is a rectangle a quadrilateral? Yes, it is. So that proves that that's false. And then finally, the contrapositive. The contrapositive is going to take the converse and negate it. So if the figure is not a quadrilateral, then it is not a square. Okay? If it's not a quadrilateral, is this true or false? This guy is true. If it's not a quadrilateral, it's not a square. It can't be a four-sided figure and be a square at the same time. That's not possible. Okay? All right, so here's what I want you to do to finish up. You have your WSQ, and then I want you to do the following down here with this statement. Write the converse, the inverse, and the contrapositive. Don't forget to complete that WSQ. This finishes section 2.2, part 2.